The Book of Ruth is one of my wife's favorite books in the Bible. I of course like it too, but for different reasons. It's a short, beautiful love story about a righteous man who rescues a virtuous widow and her mother-in-law from their distress. It's a great love story to be sure, but in the context of the Bible, we have to wonder, why is this random story in the Bible in the first place? Sure, it's well told and touching, but what does it have to do with the rest of the Bible? Well, that's what I want to show you today. The Book of Ruth actually has worldview-shattering implications for the Israelite community that would be reading it. You may think I'm being dramatic, but I'm really not. There are key elements at play that undergird this love story that would have caused the Hebrews reading it to question their entire theology and worldview. But before I reveal what's so earth-shattering about it, let me set up the story for you so you have some context that is necessary to feel that gut punch that happens at the end of the book. I would also, as always, recommend reading this book prior to watching this video, and maybe you'll be able to catch what I'm talking about. But seeing as my audience does not contain many ancient Israelites, I bet you'll miss it. Now, the Book of Ruth also has strong Christological themes that we will be looking at, so be looking out for those as you read as well. So with that, let's begin. The Book of Ruth is set in the time of Judges, which, if you're not aware, is a time of great rebellion against God and moral depravity. But what we will see is that even in this time of wickedness, there is still a faithful remnant to God. What the Book of Ruth is going to present is hope. Hope when all seems lost, hope when everyone around you is practicing wickedness, and hope for a greater and better future. But before that hope, there is great tragedy. The story of Ruth will follow three main characters: Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi. Naomi is an old woman who has lost her husband, but worse than that, she has lost her two sons as well. The significance of this may be somewhat lost on the modern audience. We can understand the pain of losing a husband and children, but what we may miss is the social and financial ramifications of the time. Being a widow essentially meant you were destitute. You had very few rights and no means of securing yourself financially. The loss of a husband is one thing, but losing your sons as well essentially meant you had no future. There were certain Mosaic laws that gave protection to widows, and we'll look at some of them soon, but it was not a situation you wanted to be in. Your property was at risk, and you had no one to take care of you in your old age. So after the loss of her sons and husband, she has no hope, or at least she doesn't see any hope in her future. But leave that part to God. He always has a plan. Before Naomi's sons died, they married two Moabite women. If you watch my Genesis Explained series, you may remember the Moabites. They're the descendants of the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. The Moabites also mistreat the Israelites quite frequently, and because of this, the law states that they shall not be allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord until the 10th generation. This prohibition essentially means no Moabite is allowed to be considered an Israelite. Israelites and Moabites had a very contentious relationship with one another, and there was a lot of lingering animosity between the two groups. I'll go into more details on this in other videos, but just know for the purposes of this video that it's there. This is going to be important for that gut punch later, so don't forget this. Now Naomi is going to tell Ruth and Orpah, her other daughter-in-law, to go home and remarry. Orpah will listen and go home, but Ruth says something incredible. "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." A very powerful statement. Ruth devotes herself not only to Naomi, but also to the God of Israel, despite being a Moabite. This is really significant for a Moabite to do. What we will see with Ruth is that she is a woman of virtuous character. Despite losing her husband and being destitute, she devotes herself to God and to taking care of Naomi, even though she will get nothing in return. Now the two women together go to Bethlehem, a very important city for two very important men. While there, Naomi renamed herself Mara, which means bitter, to exemplify her innermost feelings. She is bitter, lifeless, futureless, hopeless, and even worse, bitter towards God. But as I said earlier, God is watching over her and her daughter-in-law. Now, in Bethlehem, there lives a wealthy and virtuous man named Boaz. Remember that this book is set in the time of Judges, a time marked with great moral depravity. Boaz is a stark contrast to the nearly universal reality around him. He is a man who does everything right. He blesses his workers and they bless him in return. He takes care of residing foreigners in his land. He allows for the widows and foreigners to glean the leftovers of his harvest. He follows God's law in every case. The huge takeaway that you need to know is that he is righteous, and he also happens to be related to Naomi's dead husband. That's important for what will happen later in the story. Ruth goes to the harvest to collect the leftover grain to feed herself and her mother-in-law. She winds up in one of Boaz's fields, and Boaz takes notice of her. Boaz asks someone about her and is told of what she has done. Her virtuous act of taking care of her mother-in-law, even though she will receive nothing in return, and how she has devoted herself to the Lord. He takes pity on her and treats her exceedingly well, allowing her to glean not just from the leftovers of the harvest, but also from the sheaves collected by the harvesters. He invites her to eat from his own table. He treats her as more than a foreigner. He is giving her the rights and treatment of a native-born Israelite. Don't miss the significance of this, as she is a Moabite. There is a lot of bad blood between the two groups, and this act of kindness is a big deal. What Boaz is doing here is giving hope to this hopeless woman and her hopeless mother-in-law. He has great compassion on them because he fears the Lord. His heart is in line with God's heart, and so he does what God would do. He takes up the cause of the helpless and does the will of God by protecting them. The way Boaz treats Ruth is how Christ treats us. He gives us more than what we ask for, invites us to his banqueting table, treats us as his own and not as a foreigner. There will be many parallels to Christ in Boaz's life, so keep an eye out for them as you're reading it. When Ruth comes home with the abundant harvest and says that she was at Boaz's house, Naomi exclaims, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead. This man is a close relative of ours." Boaz is what is known in the law of Moses as a kinsman redeemer. A kinsman redeemer is someone who is responsible for protecting their relative, whether close or far off. If a relative was in financial hardship and they were forced to sell their land or even themselves into slavery, the kinsman redeemer's job would be to buy them or the property back and restore it to the person who lost it. There's more to what a kinsman redeemer would be responsible for, but for the purposes of this story, that's all you really need to know. Naomi's bitterness and hopelessness has now received some light. There's a blossom of hope for her because she knows God is looking out for her. The law of Moses gives her protection, and if her kinsman redeemer is a righteous, God-fearing man, then she knows that he'll do the right thing and redeem not only her, but also her widowed daughter-in-law, who is in great distress. That's why she comes up with a little plan. It's the end of the harvest, which means it's party time. Boaz will be celebrating the Lord's blessed harvest. So Naomi tells Ruth to prepare herself, essentially as a bride would before marriage, and to go after the party is over, to lay by Boaz's feet and to pull his cloak over her. This may seem a bit inappropriate or forward to us, but in reality, it wasn't. What she is doing is essentially a marriage proposal. She is evoking the right of a Levirate marriage to Boaz in accordance with the law of Moses. I talked about this in some detail in my Genesis Explained Part 4 video, but essentially what a Levirate marriage is it's the duty of a near relative or brother to marry the widow of their dead relative in order to preserve their inheritance and to carry on the name of the dead relative by giving the widow an offspring. It also meant that the widow would not be destitute anymore because she would have a husband again to protect her and to provide for her. So yeah, Ruth is essentially proposing to Boaz. She uses imagery of being brought under his covering. This covering language has strong Christological significance. When Ruth asks this, she is asking to be protected by him, brought into his household, his family, and his headship. It's complete submission to him, knowing he will do what is best for her. This is exactly what Christians are supposed to do with Christ. We enter into his protection. We are clothed with him, covered by his sacrifice, and in complete submission to his will. We are brought under his wings. The church is the bride of Christ. He is the head of the church, just as the husband is the head of the wife. In this scene, we also find an answer to a long-awaited question. Boaz calls Ruth a woman of excellence. The significance of this comes from Proverbs 31:10, which says, "An excellent wife, who can find? Her worth is far above jewels." So the question of who can find an excellent wife is being answered here in the book of Ruth. Who can find an excellent wife? Boaz can, a righteous man with outstanding moral character and devotion to God. He is rewarded with the crown of Ruth. Now that Ruth has proposed to Boaz, Boaz needs to make a decision. He wants to marry her, but there's an issue. He follows God's law to the best of his abilities, and there stands something in the way of them being married. There's actually someone who is a closer relative than he is, who would have first dibs on marrying her if he wanted to. If Boaz just went ahead and married her, he would be circumventing the law, and since he's a righteous man, he's not going to do that. The next morning, he sends Ruth home with more food, and then, in the words of Naomi, Boaz will not rest until he settles the matter. I love this language because it's so Christological. Boaz won't rest until he is able to redeem Ruth. He loves her, he wants to marry her, he will rest at nothing until he rescues her from her distress. It's beautiful because it shows his heart for her. Just as Boaz is with Ruth, so Christ is with us. He will rest at nothing until he redeems his sheep. So Boaz, being the righteous man that he is, goes to the city gate to do his business. He doesn't do any back alley deals, he does them where they're seen by everyone. He grabs the next of kin and says, "Hey, redeem this land." The next of kin agrees, but then Boaz springs the second half of the deal. You also have to exercise the levirate marriage to the Moabite woman Ruth, and here the next of kin backs out. It's not entirely clear why. Maybe he doesn't like Moabites, which would be fair, but more probably is that he didn't want to risk his inheritance. This is actually exactly what happened back in Genesis 38 with Judah's wicked son. He didn't want to give Tamar a son because he knew it would impact his own inheritance, and the son wouldn't be in his name. So, he wickedly spilled his seed on the ground instead. In the same way, this next of kin was more concerned with his own possessions than taking care of the widow in distress. This is a stark contrast between him and Boaz, who is more than ready to drop everything he is doing to rescue this widow. This further proves that the generation Boaz is living in is in rebellion against God, because this man cares more for wealth than following God's commands. So now, the next of kin is out of the way. Boaz can now redeem Ruth and marry her. She conceives and bears him a son. The women of the town say to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. May his name become famous in Israel." Through the course of this story, Naomi went from blessed with a husband and 2 sons to cursed with death of them all, to now blessed and redeemed again by God through Boaz and Ruth. All because Boaz and Ruth were virtuous and righteous people who obeyed God. Ruth followed God in her perfect submission to her mother-in-law and to Boaz. Boaz followed the law perfectly and in accordance with the heart of God. These two, working together, brought about a great redemption and a true love story, all of which culminates in Ruth bearing a son that is named Obed, who becomes the father of Jesse, who is the father of David, king of Israel. Boom. Bomb dropped. Boaz and Ruth, the Moabite, in a time of great moral depravity, brought forth the ancestor of King David, arguably the greatest king who sat on the throne of Israel, who is, of course, a stand-in for Christ, his descendant. So now, let's analyze this bomb a little more in depth. If you were an ancient Israelite reading this, why would it hit you so hard? You'd get to the end of the story and see this genealogy, and you'd probably drop the scroll on the floor before hastily picking it back up and rereading it over and over again. The reason it's such a bomb is because Ruth is a Moabite. She is someone who is essentially never allowed into the assembly of the Lord, and yet she is the ancestor of King David. How is this possible? She shouldn't be allowed, and yet here she is. Well, to know how this is allowed, we need to do a little lawyer work, so bear with me here. Ruth is a residing foreigner in Israel, and she's a Moabite, so she is operating under those laws that pertain to her. But she has done something very important. She has devoted herself to the Lord, the God of Israel, and come under his wing and his protection. So, even though she is a Moabite by birth, what Boaz is going to argue is that she's not really a Moabite. Like he said in chapter 2, "You have come under the refuge of the Lord." You have devoted yourself to the Lord? Well, that makes you his responsibility. And since you're his responsibility, that makes you my responsibility. You are no longer a Moabite. You are an Israelite. Now, if you think I'm stretching the law here, you're actually kind of right. I am, but so is Boaz, and so does Jesus and Paul later in the Bible. Paul uses this exact argument that Boaz is using for showing that not all who are descendants of Abraham are really his descendants. Rather, the true descendants of Abraham are those who have faith like Abraham. So when Paul says, "For not all who are descendants from Israel are Israel, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." In other words, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. You see what he's saying? A true descendant of Abraham is one who believes the promises of God, just like Abraham did. This is also why Jesus says the Pharisees are children of Satan and not Abraham. If they were really children of Abraham, they'd believe in him. What makes someone a true Israelite and descendant of Abraham is faith. That is why Ruth, who put her faith in the Lord, was able to not only enter into the assembly of the Lord, but was also the ancestor of the great King David, who is also the ancestor of Christ himself. I want you to understand this because it's huge. It really is the point of the whole book. This is why when we, who are primarily Gentiles, put our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, we are adopted into sonship. We are brought into the family of God and become true Israelites, true descendants of Abraham. Any who reject Christ are not his children. You see, one of the main underlying themes in the book is that this Moabite has greater faith than the literal descendants of Abraham. She may be a Moabite, but if you want to put it this way, not all who are Moabites, just as not all who are Israelites are Israelites. The same goes for us. Though we are not physical descendants of Abraham, we are spiritual descendants because of our faith. This is one essential aspect of the gospel. You have a kinsman redeemer who can bring you into the family of God, into the protection of Christ, to inherit the blessings and secure hope for your own future. This is what Boaz did for Ruth, and it's what Christ does for us. With this lens, go back now and reread the story and see what other parallels to Christ you can find. There are many more. God bless you all. If you learned something new, let me know below. If you want to do more reading on the topic, I recommend one of my professor's books, Old Testament Use of the Old Testament, where he goes into much greater detail, and he's also significantly smarter than me. Comment with any words of encouragement and questions, and I'll be sure to get back to you. Have a great day.